A huge saw was brought out, and I saw them cutting off the whale's head, then the tail, then cutting up the middle part. The whole of the crew swarmed around the big whale like ants around a dead body. Simonov was yelling orders. An hour and a half had elapsed from the time when the harpoon had whizzed through the air, and there was now no signs that anything out of the common had happened. The whale had been cut up, everything cleared away and stored on board. I must admit that in the early part of my whaling experiences, I had a bad time of it. I had the rough work to do. I used to cut up the fat and flesh and store it away in tubs. The whale flesh is good, like veal, but only when it has been stripped of the fat. Otherwise it has a nasty, bitter taste. I was told that we should have to catch at least 6 whales to make the expedition pay. A large black whale like the one we had just caught, which was more than 20 yards long, was said to be worth $100,000 by way of barter. It weighed as much as 45 fat oxen. What surprised me was that the huge animal was covered with hair, which looked like horsehair, nearly half an inch long. They told me that there were also gray whales, which were smaller, and the smallest of all were the white whales, which live in around Greenland. For more than 40 days, we went after whales in this icy corner of the world. We caught 11. Simonov was very pleased. During this time, I had not only made myself familiar with the jobs which a sailor must know, but by asking questions, I had found out all matters concerning whales. So later on, I was quite practiced at everything in this line. Every part of a whale is made use of. At that time, the oil was sold for $1.20 a gallon to the United States, or more often to Japan and China, where they make medicine of it, while the remnants are turned into boot polish, leather dressing, machine oil, and all sorts of other things. From the hide of the whales, the Eskimos are said to make soles for their mucklucks, or high boots, and in fact they use it also as clothing. From the stomach of the whale, when it is dried, they make waterproofs. Waterproofs of this kind are soaked in oil and never let in the damp. Whalebone is exported all over the world. The bone, especially the tail bones, which weigh several thousand pounds, are used by the Eskimos for making all kinds of tools and sledges. A polar Robinson Crusoe. When, after these busy days, we returned southwards, I felt depressed and was unwilling to leave the cold regions of the Arctic Ocean. At that time, I did not imagine that later on I would land on those shores and penetrate farther and farther through that icy wilderness, the sight of which then inspired me with horror, and that I would get to the interior of that gloomy region and hunt rare animals there. We sailed around a number of islands, where the captain bartered whale fat with the Eskimos for furs. It was with a heavy heart that I again saw the forlorn cliffs of New Siberia. The awful dreariness and the very aspect of this island, where there was not a single tree or a single blade of grass, gave me an uneasy and creepy feeling. I felt ashamed, and I did not wish to let it be seen. But Captain Simonov put his hand on my shoulder and cheered me up, saying that I should pull myself together because there were people on the other side of the island, Eskimos and white polar settlers. He advised me not to waste much time wandering about the island, but to blast a hole in the cliff at once because winter would be setting in before I could turn around. The polar storms would then arrive, and I should perish in a tent. I should not run short of anything. He was an honest employer, and for the good work I had done, he was giving me good stores, which would last until the following summer. The sailors were already loading the boat with cases of tinned food, munitions, machines. They had put in several cases of Hercules powder and dynamite, 6 cases of candles, each containing 300, planks to make doors with, all necessary tools, a warm fur polar suit, and boots. Everything, in fact, necessary for a lengthy life in these parts. I said goodbye, pushed off from the vessel, and soon was standing on the sandy shore. We carried these cases of stores where the tide would not reach them, and got them all to that distance. Goodbye, lad. Don't peg out here. The last handshake, the men jumped into the boat and pushed off. I had become a polar Robinson Crusoe. I sat down on a case and stared out to sea for a long time until the vessel disappeared. And when I stood up, feeling forlorn and lonesome, I suddenly saw that under the cliffs on some flat ground Where there was a scrubby stretch of small tundra, my reindeer were making straight for me. They galloped up. It was plain how pleased they were. Their eyes sparkled, and they put their 4 feet on my shoulders. I was moved almost to tears. I was so delighted to meet these old friends, who showed their fondness for me, that the island no longer seemed to me so cheerless and desolate. And at that moment I made up my mind that as long as I lived, I would never raise my hand against those animals, even if their bodies were the only thing between me and my death by starvation. And as a matter of fact, I never lifted a hand to them, even in anger. I traveled about with them for 3 years, and when they died, I buried them in a grave like human beings. I look for a dwelling. But now I began to be seriously worried. I pitched my tent and lived in it for a few days to start with. I went fishing and wandered about the island, looking to see where I could choose my future dwelling place. It would have to be somewhere among the rocks, where the tide would not reach. While roaming about, I also hoped to encounter some human being who would also advise me, but it was no use. I feared that Simonov might not have told me the truth, and that I was all alone there. But I pulled myself together, reminding myself that I had made the best of things so many times before, all on my own, and that I would do so again here. I had obtained very full information about where the polar storms come from, and I knew that here, on the northeast side of the island, I was at the very spot where they would strike. It was the beginning of September. I had no time to lose. So I said to myself, go and have a look at that valley between the rocks. Perhaps something will turn up there. The valley was empty, the bottom of it rocky, and round about was sheer rock rising to a height of at least 200 feet. There were no signs of any plants. No stream flowed there. No sound of a chirping bird. Nothing but rock, solid rock, terribly slashed and gnawed by polar storms. But here at last I found a spot which struck me as being fairly good, and I decided that this was where I would blast out a cave in the rock. When I had returned to the spot where my tent and all my belongings were, I noticed on the other side of the valley that there was a hole in the rock. I immediately ran up to it and peeped inside. From the smell, I concluded that it had formerly been inhabited by Eskimos. I at once attempted to squeeze my way into it, but the opening was too narrow. So I at once went down to the tent, took a chisel and hammer, easily widened the hole in that soft rock, and squeezed my way inside. Then I lit a candle and looked around to see where I was. I can assure you that although I have seen a few things in my time, never in my life have I set eyes on so much filth as there was there. In one corner of the tiny hole was a heap of decayed entrails, bones of fish and other animals. On the other side, some stinking, decayed furs, probably the bed of those who had formerly lived there. In the third corner was a pile of excrement. I looked around. Who could tell? Perhaps this might have been those people's grave as well. But I failed to discover any human bones. There were none there. Those people had no doubt perished somewhere in the open air, or had moved away to some other place. In the middle of the cavity was a hole. This was where their fire used to burn. I squeezed my way out again. The cave rather took my fancy. I decided I would settle down there. I had made my way to the tent for a pickaxe and a shovel, widened the opening in the rock still further, and then began to collect the decayed piles of filth in the cave and throw them out. As soon as I touched it, it gave off such a dreadful stench that I staggered outside quickly. I spent a quarter of an hour in the fresh air, breathed plenty of it in, and when I felt better again, I returned to my horrible job. And so I kept on, working for 3 minutes in the cave and taking breath for 5 minutes outside it. After terrific efforts, I had got rid of a part of the filth, but by this time I saw that I could not cope with the task. What was I to do now? I was not going to give in. But then another idea struck me. I walked along the shore, and I looked for timber and searched for some of the driftwood which was washed up from the Siberian mainland. For I made up my mind that I would fumigate the hole, because there was plenty of coal, and all I had to do was go up and pick it up. It was fresh coal, which flares up and burns quickly like a benzene. But first of all, I needed a little wood. I soon found this on the eastern side of the island, where it had been washed up by a high spring tide. It was already quite dry because it had been lying there the whole summer a long way from the shore.